Hi, this is Delegate Steve Aarons, District 36, representing Kent, Queen Anne, Cecil, and Caroline counties, and you're listening to the Maryland Association of Counties podcast.
Welcome to the briefing room here on the Conduit Street podcast. I'm Don Butchko, and listeners, do we have a special bonus episode here for you today? I can almost guarantee that you're going to walk away happy. We are going to be talking about data centers. We got local policy, and we're really going to be getting into those community level weeds that I know you love to get tangled in. Honestly, this episode has it all. Now, if you are just tuning in, earlier this summer, we wrapped up our series on energy. If you have not listened into yet, be sure to go back. Those are 5 episodes, plus our other bonus episode with Kelly Schultz that you are not going to regret spending some time with. The link is in our show notes. But the biggest episodes of the series were our 2 on data centers. And so we have been hearing a lot from you, the listener, that this is a subject that you want to hear more about. So we have a very special second bonus episode on data centers lined up. Let's jump in. We are joined today by Jessica Fitzwater, County Executive for Frederick County. Madam County Executive, welcome to the briefing room.
Thank you so much for having me, Dom.
Before we jump in, I want to talk a little bit about you. This is one of my favorite parts of the briefing room. We're lucky to have a lot of really interesting guests, including yourself, and our listeners love to hear about, people's paths and how they ended up kind of getting to where they're at. So before we get into all the policy stuff, tell us about Jessica Fitzwater. Who are you and how do you become county executive?
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me. We've had such a great partnership with Mako throughout my whole time as county executive, and we really value the opportunities that we have working with you and your team, but also county leaders from across the state. So how did I end up here? Well, I am a teacher. I knew from a very young age that I was wanting to be in the classroom and really had a heart for public service. My mom's a retired public school teacher, and my family has always been very arts oriented. I started playing music at a young age, and so I knew right away that I wanted to be a music teacher. So that's what I went to school for. Never left Maryland, by the way, Marylander through and through. Grew up in Washington County, went to St. Mary's College in Southern Maryland, and then landed here in Frederick for my first teaching job. I think that educators not only we know have a heart for public service, but really know the community. But not only that, I learned really quickly that we are also in one of the most highly politicized professions that exists. And so as I was a new teacher, kind of getting my footing here in Frederick, I realized pretty quickly that I wanted to be a strong voice for my students and for my school and for my profession. That involved getting very involved in my local teachers union, Frederick County Teachers Association, as well as MSEA and NEA, and really showing up to talk to the community and elected officials about the impact of their decisions on students and classrooms every day. So I would say that's sort of how I got bit by the political bug. I don't have anyone in my family that had ever run for office before, so it's not like I really saw that part of public service modeled. But I knew that I wanted to be a voice for public education and making sure that our communities are making the smartest investment that they can, which is investing in our students and investing in education, because that truly is our future. So I ran for the first time in 2014 to serve as a member of the first ever Frederick County Council, as we were just transitioning to being a charter county. And I had the opportunity to serve my district, District 4, for 8 years on the county council while I was still teaching, also while I became a mom, but really learned a lot about the legislative process, about how local government works, focused a lot of my legislative work on affordable housing initiatives, protecting the environment, focusing on social justice and human rights issues, and just ultimately trying to make sure that government is here to make life better for people. I had the pleasure of working with our first ever county executive, Jan Gardner, and wanted to make sure that we kept Frederick County moving in a positive direction, that we took the advantage of the fact that we're a growing county that's bringing opportunity to our residents and keeping that trajectory going. And so I ran for county executive in 2022, and now here I am.
A little fun fact. I hope you can confirm if it's true or not. But my understanding is you mentioned St. Mary's. Is it true that you went to St. Mary's with the mayor of my favorite city in Maryland, Baltimore City, Brandon Scott. Is that a fact?
That is a fact. Brandon and I did student government together at St. Mary's College. There's actually a lot of St. Mary's alum in elected office. Robert White, who's on the DC City Council and was just nominated in the primary there to represent DC in Congress, also went to St. Mary's with us, which is pretty cool. So small little school, really punching above its weight here in Maryland.
I love that. All right, now let's transition and start to talk policy. So first, as a starter, can you explain kind of why Frederick County is at the epicenter of the data center conversation in Maryland? Because you guys are really at the tip of the spear in terms of like policy development and in terms of actually projects moving forward. So why Frederick? Why are you guys the number one in Maryland?
Well, I think first of all, this has been an issue that we've been working on for many years. So really before it became the national focus that it is, Frederick County was already, as you said, the tip of the spear. We were already looking at making sure that we had sufficient regulations here locally. And part of that is because we are just across the Potomac River from Loudoun County. As you know, Loudoun is home to the largest cluster of data centers in the entire world. And so that proximity obviously made Frederick County a place where data centers were interested in coming. But it also means that our residents see an example of sometimes what happens when maybe certain policies weren't as well thought out or the regulations weren't revisited as often as they should. So even before I was county executive, the county was really looking at this issue. The Quantum Frederick campus that's being built now was approved before I was county executive. And while we haven't approved any new data center projects in Frederick County in 5 years, that is a large project that is currently under construction now. And yeah, that means that we are experiencing some growing pains through that, especially as we're dealing with an industry that is rapidly evolving, which is probably an understatement. And so it's truly been our obligation to make sure that as this project continues to move forward, as we continue to learn about this rapidly evolving industry, that we're using every tool that local government has to make sure that they are properly regulated. They're in fact the most regulated industry in Frederick County, and that our community is getting benefits out of the industry while they're here.
I want to zoom in for a minute on the actual campus that this project is based on. And one of the things I love when we're talking about this is kind of how Frederick was forward thinking in determining where we can put this. And so there's a bit like, if you think about solar, there's a big debate about don't put this on greenfield development. There's better places that we can locate this. And the campus in Frederick County is a brownfield. I mean, it's a former industrial site that, has a lot of pollution and just so happened to have the energy hookups. But the idea of like using space that would be an economic cost, and now you're potentially using that for an economic driver. I mean, my mind just explodes. That is like the best public policy making. So can you kind of talk a little bit about that location?
Yeah, this is a very unique site. So it's actually one of the largest industrial zone sites on the East Coast. The Quantum Frederick is on the former East Alco property. This was an aluminum smelting plant in the Adamstown area in South Frederick County that was operational for many years. Obviously, a very highly intense industrial use, pretty dirty industry, very impactful to the community, was decommissioned, deregulated, and the site has been there. And so because of how large the site is and some of the natural buffering around it, and the fact that the energy and water infrastructure is already there because of the industrial use that had been there previously, it is really an ideal location. The site was purchased originally by Quantum Frederick in 2021. It received its preliminary approvals in December of 21. And then in March of 2022, when I was still on the county council, we unanimously voted in our first critical digital infrastructure ordinance to set design and siting regulations for data centers. Again, one of the first counties really to do this, because we knew from Loudoun and other places that we're starting to treat data centers just like warehouse or office or other uses that are clearly quite different, that it was our obligation to really define this use specifically and make sure that there were appropriate regulations in place. When I came into office, we knew that, again, because this industry is changing so rapidly, that we would have to hone in on those that bill from 2022 and make even more additional changes. So I stood up pretty quickly a data centers work group that had diverse representation, public meetings, and one of the biggest questions it grappled with was where should data centers be allowed to go and where should they be prohibited? The original legislation allowed that if all those criteria were met, it was a by right use in industrial, which could open us up to pockets of industrial use land being rezoned across the county and data centers popping up and that data center sprawl, which we really wanted to make sure that we addressed. So that was one of the biggest questions that the data center work group looked at. And it's why early on I passed an executive order to pause rezonings to industrial to make sure that both the community and the industry understood that we were taking this work very seriously and we would not be entertaining any rezonings while we were strengthening our regulations.
One of the big things that I love when I'm talking with your with you, but also with your subject matter folks, you guys really did kind of look at Loudoun County and say, what are the lessons that we can learn? And I think that point that you just brought up with we don't want it to be data centers everywhere. That's the biggest criticism coming out of Loudoun, that it's just these massive windowless warehouses that are truly just gigantic buildings dotting the landscape. And so the idea that you found a location that was kind of like the perfect one and you're building around that, but then limiting it so you don't have the worst impacts, I think that's absolutely brilliant. And so I want to, transition with that. I can't give enough just like big warm hugs to the Frederick County staff, because you're probably one of the first calls I make. And I have to give a shout out really quick to Mike Wilkins and Shannon Moore, because whenever there's a fire at Annapolis, they're either my first or second call. But the reason I say this is because you have a lot of expertise. You can just hear it from the way you're describing that when you were doing the process for standing up data center regulations, you have great people doing it, but you also did the work. And I think that's really important. Can you dig a little deeper on what was that process like to develop those regulations? There's a lot of counties now starting where you guys were 5+ years ago. So if I'm a county official and I want to get to where you are there any big considerations? Are there lessons, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I was going to shout out some of our staff if you didn't, so I'm glad you did. We really do have just across county government really exceptional public servants here in Frederick County who really have developed subject matter expertise on a lot of issues. And we love whenever we get to partner with Mako and with other counties to just, no one wants to reinvent the wheel. We all want to make sure we're working together on complex issues such as this. But really, when you shouted out Mike, I mean, again, before I was even county executive, when Jan was county executive and I was on the county council and we were already looking at this, there was an immense amount of research by Mike and his team and other county partners to look at what's happening in Loudoun, what's happening in other counties across the state. It was hard to find some of those best practices. We're talking like 5-6 years ago at this point, because there were still a lot of unknowns and there weren't a lot of counties going down this path yet. So again, the fact that in 22 we already had passed our first bill on this really did set us apart. But since then, in 2025, our current county council passed significant amendments to that ordinance to even strengthen the regulations further. So again, when we say they're the most regulated industry, it's not like just a talking point. Like, we have really strengthened these regulations on many, many areas, including a lot of the things that we hear concerns about. So when we're talking about mitigating the risks and regulating the industry, understanding just some of the challenges, we focused on regulating noise and vibration, the visual impacts, any sort of ecological mitigation, backup generator technology, and again, on the zoning side, where they can go and where they can't go, because these are the tools that local government has. Another challenge is that a lot of the questions around energy, air quality, even to some extent water, those are not county regulations. Those are state regulations. And that's why working with Mako, working with our state delegation and our state partners is very important on this issue, because many of the challenges have to be regulated at the state level or really regionally or federally when we're talking about energy. So the other point I wanted to make, and I had mentioned it earlier, we've used temporary moratoriums and pauses on development throughout this process to allow for time and space for our staff, for our legislative body, and for the community to just study and regulate this complex industry. Moratoriums are trendy right now, but we were doing that. We were using these tools before. Again, that pause on rezonings was really important as we were doing our work group and making sure that people knew how seriously we were taking this and not trying to let anything come in under the wire while we're still have recognized that changes need to be made.
Really quick,
Yeah.
I love that talking point. We did moratoriums before they were cool. All these other guys, they're late to the party. We were hitting the pause button well before any of these other guys.
Well, and it's look, we have to use every tool at our disposal, and we have to recognize what's in local government's lane. I will say this is one of the biggest challenges on this topic because rightly so, our residents have a lot of questions and concerns, and that has only spiked because this has become such a national conversation. And if you're not sure if the information you have is accurate, you don't know, you have concerns, questions, really frankly fears about what may be coming, those are really legitimate. And often you as a resident, you don't necessarily know what level of government is regulating at all these different topics. And sometimes, especially when you're upset, you don't really care. And so our job is to, be responsive, be listening, and educate and be really clear about here are the things in our control and here's what we've done. Here's where we've advocated with our partners at other levels of government when it's not in our control. So every time, we show up at a committee hearing, meet with a delegate or a senator, write a letter to, a state body, a state regulatory body, that is all part of this as well, because it has to be these different sort of levers of government working in partnership to make sure that we do this right.
See, I love the way that you put that too, because it's a little bit of a trope when we say it in a hearing, but like counties really are the closest level of government to the people, just because, some stuff's regulated by the state, some by the feds, et cetera. But a lot of those complaints, you might call your delegate, you're definitely calling your county executive and your county council person. One thing I wanted to highlight that you brought up that I think is important. So counties, we do have broad authority over zoning. We do have broad authority over APFO, but there's a lot of this that's just not us. Like certain water stuff has to go through MDE. Energy stuff, I think we all know very well and clear we are very preempted when it comes to energy. And so I love that idea of, communication and partnership. I want to move on a little bit. So as you went through this process, is there anything that with hindsight, you're like, I wish we could have done that differently, or anything that's just on your radar that needs to be revisited in the future? Initially, you said that this is just an industry moving so fast. And so I think for counties listening to this, having that in mind, that your regulations may look perfect today, but technology is going to update in a year or two, and all of a sudden we're going to be back and having to update stuff. I think that's really important. So is there anything that you're looking at that you think might need to be tweaked in the future or likely will be?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is yes, because with an industry that is evolving and growing as fast as data centers and AI, and again, all the other levels of government that regulate this and what may change there that impacts things that we may or may not do locally, we absolutely have to be revisiting these regulations and updating them as often as needed. One of the recommendations out of our data center work group was that there has to be a regular cadence to looking at these regulations and making sure that they're as strong and up to date as possible, given just the rapidly changing technology. The other thing, too, is just the landscape on this issue has changed dramatically during the time since we've been working on this. During my tenure on the county council and as county executive, you sort of mentioned this at the top of the show, but that's a part of this as well. The national landscape around this issue, people's opinions and feelings about the issue, and then just the questions that people have, which often include what is state or federal government also going to either regulate, deregulate, or impose upon us that's going to impact the way that we do things. For just an example, when we did our data center work group, which met for almost a year from beginning to when the report was published, and one of our first meetings out in the community was at Carroll Manor Elementary School. We had barely 25 people show up to that meeting, but if we'd had a meeting like that today, it would probably need overflow parking and would be standing room only. So really just indicates just the changing, temperature, but also just attention that people are paying to this issue. And then I do want to say one other thing in terms of, your question about changing landscape and what we need to keep paying attention to, especially in terms of how different levels of government work together. One of the executive orders that I put out now requires that any future applications include proof of registration with the Public Service Commission's large load customer registry that was passed as part of that Relief Act. We don't regulate energy. So it isn't something that we can require certain people say, just make data centers do their own energy on their sites. That's not something counties can do. But now that this state is introducing a process, we can say we want proof that you've registered through this process to see what is the demand going to be and how is that going to be handled in the regional grid. That's information that we're requiring. So again, as these different policies are or legislation is enacted at other levels of government, it can also give us an opportunity to be responsive and to incorporate that into our own processes.
Zooming out for a second, we have a lot of your peer county listeners as well as state level policymakers who tune into this. What are some practical takeaways that would be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, specifically for counties, I would say really just don't be afraid to confront new information, right? We have to be really paying attention to how quickly that this industry is changing. And so when the landscape changes or new information is presented, new opportunities, new challenges, we have to be responsive. At the county level, it means you're going to need to think too about who on your team is sort of paying attention to this. This requires a lot of collaboration across different departments. We're talking about planning. We're talking about energy and environment. We're talking about, other legislative processes, government relations. So making sure that you've got the right team sort of paying attention to this issue and following along with what's happening, not just in the state of Maryland, but really across the country. And I'd say the other thing too is communicate clearly and often with your community and make sure that you're making every single decision through a public process. Obviously, that is our duty in local government, but especially with an issue that's just so complex, making sure that information is available in many different formats, that you're, doing community meetings, getting in front of people, having FAQs, all of those things to make sure that people have access to information and how decisions are being made.
One last question for you before we wrap up. Looking ahead, what do you think the future of data centers will be, both in Frederick County and in Maryland broadly?
Well, I think one thing for certain is that this industry isn't going away and that it's changing rapidly. So we will all, I think, be dealing with the challenges and opportunities in this industry for a long time. And that local governments, look, we are not pro data center or anti data center. Our job is to regulate the industry to the fullest extent of our authority, protect the public health, safety, and welfare of our community, and again, recognize that there are pieces of this equation that are regulated at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. So really making sure that we find our lane and then work collaboratively and effectively with other partners, community partners, with other levels of government to make sure that we're protecting our communities.
Awesome. I think that is a great place to leave it. Big thank you to County Executive Fitzwater for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Dom.
Let me read us out. Remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Summer Conference is around the corner, so register now for the annual Mako Summer Conference, August 12th through the 15th in Ocean City, Maryland. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to this bonus episode of The Briefing Room here on the Conduit Street Podcast.